Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Clarifying Validation Project from the Pathology Innovation Collaborative Community. We have a somewhat packed agenda. We have as to-do items for today to review some of the consensus statements. And of course, we have an online manuscript version shared with the invite. If you haven't seen it, please take a look. And meeting minutes and recordings are online as previously stated. And then Amanda has put together the working documents. So I thought to make this efficient today, the documents are here, and then the online manuscript version is going to be here. Let's see if this works. If that will not work, I hope that will work. Amanda, do you want to drive maybe the online manuscript part, or should I?
Either. Um, would you like a review of what's been done, or should we just go to where the majority of the comments are?
I think that would be great. So maybe we can start with the consensus statements and then just go through those with the people that are online now, and
Sure.
then go to the comments, because hopefully we can then move towards sharing the manuscript for editing. And then I think we have one more meeting next week and then see that we can finalize it for final send around to everyone.
Okay. Um, so our first consensus statement revolves around the ambiguity in communication. For now, I don't think there have been many updates for this consensus recommendation. I don't know if anyone wants to chime in and offer some updates.
Um, I really like the part, especially when working in interdisciplinary teams. So when I reread this last night, if someone has an idea how to move this further to the front, that might help because, when you're in a lab meeting and everyone knows that you're using validation in a certain context, it doesn't matter that much whether you use validation or performance establishing validation or performance metric validation of sensitivity, because everyone knows we're talking about this. But I thought this addition when working in interdisciplinary teams, or when you, let's say, give a talk, or when you talk with people outside of your specific domain of the context of use of that word, I mean, just to give you the quick story why I was recently working with my team on a validation report, and everyone knew what is being validated. So the term validation report could mean tons of things after knowing what we discussed here, but in that context, it's totally fine. So I don't know if someone has an idea to emphasize that we're not discouraging the use of the term generically, but especially when you work with groups that may not use the same context, that you should probably specify what you mean with that term. I don't know if
So
that
this
makes
point, oh, sorry. This is a
sense.
point I really like because for me it was reading this text. It was first communication. What do we mean with communications in what matter and what sense? And if we put this more on the front to have this communication interdisciplinary between teams, then I think the whole term communication is more clear.
So, do you think you need to go into more detail about validation plan and validation report? Because those can also be slightly different.
So, what I think I don't know if we tried to say that here, but so if we would work on a validation plan versus a validation report, and I would send you a text message and you would know that we work on a validation plan. And we spoke for weeks about validation plan, and I would text you saying, hey Fabienne, do you have the validation ready? You would know it's the plan because we know because we're internal. But then if we go to a national meeting and present this is the validation plan, we should probably include the word plan, or we should probably include the design specifications in the validation plan, or whatever it is. So the word validation alone doesn't make a lot of sense, or not. It could mean something else unless you know the specific context. So I was just a bit surprised that especially when working in interdisciplinary teams, comes last. Somehow I think for a consensus recommendation, it would be something like consider when working in interdisciplinary teams. Yeah, I didn't have a good way of bringing that to the front.
Well, I don't know if it works as a concept, but you could say when working in interdisciplinary teams, it is important to avoid miscommunication and ensure clarity by being specific. I mean, I don't know if that is how you want to phrase a consensus recommendation, Joe, but if you want to bring it up to the front, that could be one way to do it.
So I was just thinking, I use the term validation in specific contexts all the time. And I hope to be sure that everyone talks about the same context. But if you work with a team every day or every week or whatever in your monthly meetings, and they all know what validation is spoken about, this consensus recommendation is not that important as it is when you start working with, let's say, a team of 9 that come from completely different backgrounds, where you may want to specify what you validated or what you consider validation. I don't know how to say that.
So you need to validate their understanding of validation. So Joe, if I say I'm validating my model, maybe I ask you, how do you interpret what I just said? And then if we're aligned, good.
Yes. I think last time Keith mentioned that we should provide examples. This would be a perfect example, right? It would be like, example, 2 teams come together to discuss whatever the implementation, just like you said it, that would be probably very helpful to understand what, yeah.
Yeah, you could even name which teams that would be. So for example, a laboratory team and a software development team come together, or a quality assurance team and a software team come together. They're going to use those terms wildly differently.
Mm-hmm.
I like it. And then, so we're effectively arguing in that setting that the teams should clarify what they mean with validation. So if then, in this case, the lab team and the software team explain specifically, following our consensus recommendation 1, in their context, what the term validation means, it might reveal that it's absolutely perfectly aligned, or it might reveal that they're not aligned. And I think then they can work either, they can continue, check, Roger, okay, go, or hey, wait, that's something completely different. And then it helped avoid problems down the road. I think that's fair.
I put it in the chat. I mean, I don't think it's communication, it's definition. That it's the ambiguity in definition and having this conversation too late in a multidisciplinary team. So I think the recommendation here really is to clarify your domain-specific definition early on and center any inter-domain, inter-team communication on this definition or the agreement of the definition. So you define, you agree, and then you put this as your center for the next steps.
Great point. The define, agree, and center sounds like something we should put in there. It's very cool.
And then we also don't have the communication misunderstanding. So communication in some terms is, I don't know, linked to marketing, whatever. So maybe then it's clearer. So I like this very much. Yeah.
I like the team specific definition, because like even when you give a talk or when you publish something, you define the area of context, right? And then that becomes the team. No, I like it. This is great.
Maybe
Any
just
other?
as an
Oh,
example,
go ahead.
I'm a baby lab director now, right? And so now I have to write my validation reports. And even then it's like, oh, yes, you write one validation plan or report, but it doesn't have to be as defined or as extensive for this essay as it has to be for that essay. Like, but why, right? So even within one domain, it really depends on the different essay or I mean, that's flow specific, but just as another example that even within one group, it can have different definitions of requirements and contents.
One thing we could consider when it comes to how to define or defining is to talk about what the outcome is of validating. Like, what are you going to claim? What are you going to be able to say when you have validated? That might be useful. Oh, well, that's not what I'm hoping to achieve here. I mean, I want to achieve X, not Y.
I really like that suggestion. I've been trying to figure out like what the origins of validation, the term validation is in AI versus laboratory medicine. In lab medicine, it seems to stem from pharmaceutical industry. Back in the, I think maybe 50s to 70s, that's when it started being used. And the question we were trying to answer is, does this test or assay reliably measure what it claims to measure under defined conditions? Whereas for AI, it seems to come from the 1960s to 80s with expert systems like Mycin. And the question they were trying to answer there is, does this model generalize well to unseen data, or does it perform reliably in real-world conditions? And they both seem to ask the same question, just phrased kind of differently. And they get at concepts of external validity in the research domain as well.
I would agree with that. I think it really did stem from an estimation of risk of the model in terms of looking at if we use this model setup with this data, what are our confidence intervals here in terms of loss or performance? And techniques like cross-fold validation really are an estimation of this variability. So similar definitions.
But I like framing this in the light of that question. What question are you trying to answer when you validate an AI model?
In a way, I like this, Andy and Jensen, when Amanda said earlier, if then the two teams would discuss, I mean, with validating this, it would be a great tip to say, to communicate what you mean with validation, consider what the outcome is, right? That when you derive your whatever validation metrics, is it supporting your claim or something when explaining this term? Because what question are you trying to answer is a good hint for when you explain what you mean with that term. Norman.
Yeah, hi there. I just wanted to add the question here. Is it like, maybe I missed the beginning, so sorry for being late. Isn't it more about the questions and the use cases that we are talking about than the actual teams? I mean, I understand why you are coming from the teams, because normally a certain team has a certain focus, right? The software developer has a certain focus when talking about the term, but I mean, I think it's much more about the actual goal or the actual use case that these teams are working on, and less about the teams itself.
I would I know why you say that, but then you end up with, for example, a publication written, and the term is consistently used within that publication, but you can't immediately transfer it into another domain. So I think the idea between interdisciplinary teams is that when things come together, and right now AI is hitting medicine. So what Jansen just said, that the origin is slightly different, causes tremendous confusion. So when we say we clarify the term validation, and we say, look, as long as you're consistent within that, or you answer your question, that's fine. I think that might miss the point a little bit, because it is used, I think, entirely different in those two domains that I think that is heavily represented in this call.
Yeah, and that's why I'm saying, right? So does it matter if I'm in the role of a software developer or of someone who is like going with a certain algorithm towards prioritization or towards like regulatory clearance to make a cleared product out of it? I mean, I can have like I can have different roles, and they are depending on the use case that I'm on the goal that I'm actually trying to approach. That's why I was more thinking about the actual goal or use case, because in a certain use case, the term should have a certain definition. And as we all know, we are switching teams and switching roles. So we might also need to switch the terms according to our goals that we are trying to fulfill.
So, I mean, it might come back in the consensus recommendation number 4, because that is, I think part of what Jansen said is in recommendation number 3. So, what are you suggesting? Maybe I should clarify that.
Yeah, I think it's like less about the teams get together and they define according to their background the term to be used and define it. But when people meet, when teams meet, they meet for a certain reason. So they have that goal. And so according to the goal,
Right.
the vocabulary should be defined, right? Because of the ambiguity in the communication that
Got
was
it.
mentioned before. But
So,
maybe it's just the same thing, but just calling it
no,
in
but
terms of
I,
teams more
I think it's similar to what Andy said. So the tip is keep the shared goal in mind, right? What is the claim that this validation should confirm or establish? All right. I think let's move on to the second part, because that's a bit more concrete, the second recommendation.
All right. So Dr. Kademi and I have added quite a bit to this
Mandy,
area.
would you, I just wanted to add on that, if we can go back to the definition and probably add that this is not a one-time process and this needs to be renewed whenever systems are updated or upgraded. So do you think we need to add that as well?
Yeah, we can add that, of course.
Yeah, because it's not a one-time process. It needs to be renewed or upgraded whenever, changes are made, and whether it is for the software or whether it is for the equipment.
Great point. Thank you.
Okay. can I briefly review the various ambiguity in AI? So when people claim model validation, I think there's a little bit of confusion between what AI developers are doing and then what regulatory science would be looking for. We usually do an architecture search where we define what the actual underlying architecture is. And for us, this could be model validation because the architecture will influence how things generalize, how things train, et cetera. We also do a hyperparameter validation where we're tuning the ways that we train it in terms of regularization or early stopping, the processes that surround training the final weights of the model. And then we can do, I don't know if this is the right term here, but this is essentially a locked weight validation. After we have our final weights with our final data set that we used for training, this is assessed by regulatory bodies, et cetera. So we usually refer to these three things as validation steps. But there is a little confusion because a lot of people would assume that this hyperparameter tuning is the tuning process and does not qualify as their definition of validation. Furthermore, the validation set has a lot of ambiguity. So I've tried my best to summarize this. It could be expanded, but we've all seen the train validation test. It's also called train dev test, train tune test now. For this would be an internal validation where this validation set is being used to update the weights and constantly being checked during each epoch iteratively. There's also, and then this essentially would be defined as the FDA by the development data. I typically do not see performance reportings on this test set unless it's specifically needed for like a generalization loss gap analysis or something else. There's also this type of internal validation where the train validation split comes from the same domain. And there is ambiguity here when people report on this because this could have been used iteratively to update the weights, or it could have been disjoint. So the ambiguity here causes maybe an over-optimize or a optimistic bias or something. And then there's also external validation. So some people call train test, some people call it train validation, but this would essentially be like an external disjoint validation set. I see these terms being used kind of interchangeably without clarity. And then also, Joe and I had a very long conversation over what cross-validation meant to us, and we realized that there is strikingly different interpretations of the actual implementation of cross-validation. So I interpret it as training K models on K data splits, and then looking at the overall assessment and the aggregation of these models. Joe's version is a little bit different where it involves training one model to find those parameters. So this is just a summary of some of the different points of ambiguity in terms of like, even within the AI domain, everyone kind of has a different interpretation of validation. So our consensus statement is up here. This is what was originally proposed. Based on what I found in that table, I've added these recommendations. They're not exhaustive, but can everyone see? Yeah, it's all good. Okay. So any feedback on how we should recommend AI developers to use or state their definitions of validation? Sorry.
This is where it gets a bit muddy for me because some of what you talked about actually bleeds into what FDA considers verification of software.
I know.
And not validation. Verification is are you building the product the right way and according to design specifications, unit specifications, which could be the architecture.
Correct. I think that, yeah, they ask you to state up front the intended use and how you have designed the model. but the way in which it was designed in our field requires validation of like, does the FDA ask for like loss landscapes of model architectures and these types of things that we would look at? I don't know.
I think in
No.
the software guidelines, the verification is essentially, are you building the product right? And validation is, are you building the right product?
I mean, I think it's okay if it's messy here. That's kind of the point, right? And so if validation is used this way, Amanda, which I wouldn't know, then let's acknowledge that, and that that the similar activity might be viewed as verification in another context. That's okay.
So with that being said, would it be I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Kim.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, with that being said, would it be, worth, just acknowledging that in the text about, the verification versus validation? I mean, I don't know if we want to, jump into that kettle of worms, but
verification versus validation.
I think we
can.
So we have a whole section about validation in regulatory science. So maybe we can add that there rather than here, because here it's more, I would say this is the section that most engineers and computer scientists will focus on, because, we will have a heavy emphasis on AI ML. So,
sorry, I'm just making a note.
Jensen, can you say that again? You meant, so the design specifications, you mentioned that it's building the product right, correct?
Yeah, which I think some of these concepts like model architecture and hyperparameters might fall under software verification. I'm talking about software here, not IVDs. The FDA has a completely different guideline for software. And then I think software validation is, are you building the right product? So does it meet the user's needs?
So I think you could argue that to meet someone's needs, you must have a model that is able to converge within a specific confidence interval based on repeated assessments. And I think this is why we call it model validation, because we're ensuring that this will meet the needs of the user.
But once that is done, you would need to validate that, because so far the term validation has only verified that the architecture is correct, but not that the performance is what the user expects.
Performance as in
an out-of-domain real-world data set, like the user would want to use it in real-world implementation.
Locked weights, locked model, locked algorithm. Yeah, okay.
But what would you call that then? Testing, right? Or inference.
Performance evaluation. Yeah, inference evaluation.
That's called T&E in machine learning, testing and evaluation.
Yes.
T&E, yeah. But in an IVD, it would be considered establishing performance characteristics, aka validation.
Like that? Is it like this, T&E?
Yeah, that's what I've seen in all of the AI conferences.
Okay.
The session they usually call T&E.
There's both different definitions of these terms, like verification and validation, as well as sort of nested like components within a device, right? You might be validating something in this part of it, or verifying it. But then that is, I think I'm getting it backwards, but they can, then that similar activity for the whole system might be called something else.
So let's go over this consensus recommendation. So we argue for standardizing terminology to ensure transparency in how data adequacy, model design, model optimization, model performance metrics are applied and interpreted across development and deployment settings. And then e.g., we recommend to distinguish phases. Okay. I mean, I really like the table that you put together, Amanda, because I would have had no idea how complicated this is. Because unless you're an engineer, I mean, you underappreciate how many layers there are and how many things you can change. So I think that is definitely important to have that there to refer to it, that might be in the hype or bubble of AI. Currently, everyone thinks AI is one thing, but it's not. And the other part that I find really important here in this consensus recommendation is also the point about data, because that is often forgotten, whether the data is adequate to actually train and or assess something.
So you're talking about specifically the data stratification for TNE? Because I think it's recommended that it happens at an institution level and is representative of the target, but engineers or developers can report either instance level, patient stratified, or institution
Exactly.
stratified. Yeah.
But when someone says I validated this and you just checked at the instance level
Mm-hmm.
and you don't
Internally.
say it internally and you don't say that, and you know that slide deck is sent somewhere, I'm just thinking about some practical elements. It may not be clear that that was not at the patient level or in the institution level. So therefore, I think of course, it depends on the context, but I think the recommendation will hopefully help to raise awareness of the various layers there that might just be implied within one setting, but yeah.
So I think that the recommendation is clear. And I see a piece here where you ask a question about, should we have new terms? Are
Yep.
there specific ones that you would recommend new terms for, or was this just in general as a way to just sort of like harmonize certain common things?
I'm unsure about this.
Yeah.
I think it would be very difficult to recommend new terms and have entire
Right.
AI communities even stepping away from the validation set, because
Exactly.
it's so ingrained. Like, yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
take it out. But what I really liked is this hint: see software verification under FDA or under certain regulatory bodies, because that is really a different mental framework. Software as a medical device and design
Yes.
specifications, usability requirements. There's like IEC standards. They don't have an IVD in mind. But now that many AI tools hit the laboratory sector, these terminologies collide. And so while I don't think we should recommend new terms, we should definitely raise awareness of the software verification versus FDA approved IVD verification means something entirely different.
I think there might be two different questions, and you could probably tie them in here. One question is, did you choose the right architecture for the use case, which potentially is it valid? The other question, which software verification asks, is, did you build it correctly according to your design specifications?
What is FDA's definition of verification?
I'll put it in the chat.
And just a reminder, there's a laboratory definition of verification too.
Yeah, which is different.
Oh, okay.
Actually, it's the exact mirror opposite of FDA's definition. Meaning FDA's definition of validation is the lab's definition of Anyway, it's different.
I think it would be good to just raise awareness for this. I mean, we can put that in a supplement to just say, here's a great example where another term, because I mean, our paper will hopefully be called clarifying validation, but the term verification is very closely related and can also have very, very different meanings. Okay, but just
adding in.
just to stay on track, so far consensus statement 2 is okay. We just want to add a few more nuances to it to explain why that is so critical. Because this really is sort
I
of
have one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have one question here with regard to
sorry.
the recommendation, consensus recommendation 2 wording. I'm struggling a few minutes already with deciding, do we want to really have deployment settings in that definition? So was that consciously put there? Because from the developer's perspective, and this is where we are talking about here, as I understood, it's a whole different story in the pipeline when we are talking about deployment. Right? Because then everything is
Right.
fixed. You don't. So when as long as we are in the development, literally you can do more or less everything. Yeah. When we are in the deployment, you are not allowed to change anything. Everything is fixed. Yeah. You might even get discussions if you're changing some hyperparameters or some performance metrics even. Yeah. Because that all has to be defined in the intended use long beforehand. So that's why I'm wondering, why do you put here also? Because that's making it fuzzy to my mind. Because it's not about the development anymore.
Well, that again depends on the definition, right? The end part before you go live is considered the implementation. And then whatever the model is deployed and is, let's say, fit for clinical use, as deemed by the medical director when signing the performance assessment report. So you could call that process deployment. Once the model is deployed and you do performance monitoring, that would be the next stage. And then there's also a takedown. I don't know, I think Johnson has probably most experience with this, but I think the why deployment is here is because that really, at least to my understanding, ends the part where you're still in development and you go, I don't know, clinically live.
Yeah, validation really is the stage in between development and deployment. But then you could also revalidate after it is deployed if there's drift or shift.
Oh, but that's more post-market surveillance.
Well, no,
right?
I mean, in a lab, we would revalidate it.
So for example, when you, I don't know, I know mostly for molecular, when you get a new batch of primers or new reagents, you just spot check, revalidate, and then if they're within the same performance metrics, those can be deployed. So it is it's a verification of elements. But I see your point, Noam, because here,
from a software perspective, from a software developer perspective, deployment is a whole different story than for the molecular tests that you mentioned, right? So I think that's
if you do pipeline, I just finished a cross-verification report of a bioinformatics pipeline that's software development, and you need that to be verified before deployment. But the question here is really what you're asking is, should we make this consensus recommendation across the whole life cycle, or should we just do it before implementation. That's the point, right?
Exactly.
I think when you get into concepts like model validation in the table, that's really during development.
Correct. So let's do this. Let's take deployment out here because I know consensus recommendation number 3, which is the next one we should jump to. It's actually talking about analytical and clinical validation. And that
I'm
is,
okay to jump?
yes.
Okay.
Just because we just have this, and let's double check that that is there.
This is our consensus statement currently. Would this be done in deployment?
Well, to some,
pre-deployment.
this is the pre-deployment, but I know some laboratories launch assays when they're analytically validated, then they collect clinical data, and after a while check whether they find, for example, certain things in the adequate prevalence, or you pick your outcome, and then consider that the clinical validity as post hoc examined. That's why I was just thinking about this, the deployment point that Norman made. No, but I think for this manuscript, it makes sense to keep deployment for later. I don't know. The next part is validation, regulatory science. So that seems, at least for regulated products, all pre-deployment, right?
So maybe deployment could be something in the discussion section that we could, literally like add and build upon, saying that this is, another entity that, we need to consider between, the clinical space and the, engineering space that we can, follow up on, as a field.
Great point, Kim. So clear distinction between AV and CV. Here's all right. If someone feels strongly about it, please make a mental note and add it in the manuscript. But I think that is something that's, at least in my experience, something very, very important also for regulatory or for CLIA, in case we work under CLIA, to distinguish those from one another.
My only suggestion for this, Joe, is
Yes.
I don't know that we should say it is needed or that it exists. I mean, there is a clear distinction, and we have to abide by it.
Right.
And it depends on the claims that we're making.
Maybe we can just make this is ensuring, I don't know. I see the point. It's not only needed, it's there. It's like
Yes.
or maybe just
I don't want it to be interpreted as we need to develop this because this already
No,
exists. This is the
we should
paradigm
just
we work in.
maybe we should just do it like clear distinction between AV and CV.
Yeah.
Ensures, right?
Okay.
Clear distinction between AV ensures accuracy. Yeah, that sounds like a recommendation. Okay.
Good.
All right.
All right. Number 4 for regulatory.
And that's where that life cycle thing comes in. So that's good. And then I like, Kim, that we can come back to the deployment issue in the discussion, because that's far too complicated to detangle that in recommendations. So in my notes here, the term global was a little confusing because you could see that as a territorial versus, and it's twice in this recommendation. So the context of any regulation is always by nation, And I don't think we mean nations here. I think we mean end to end or something like that.
Holistic.
Yeah.
Change. And this one too?
Yep.
Yeah. I'm wondering if we actually need that word at all, right? So from a
Innovation and market
regulatory
entry.
and product lifecycle perspective, harmonization of validation standards is essential. Aligning definitions and expectations across jurisdictional. I guess there's a word missing there. Will ensure consistency and the evaluation of safety, efficacy, and quality, ultimately accelerating responsible innovation, and market entry. Does the word, I don't know, does the word?
I definitely agree with the second one is not required. Well, the first one, I think, especially in this, like that we have like 4 recommendations or
Yeah.
ending up here in the 4th recommendation, it obviously shows that it has to be inspected, viewed from a holistic perspective.
I don't know. Sorry, I just wrote the territories, but territories is not right. Because
Jurisdictions.
it might not be jurisdictions, it might actually be statutory. Because it's like when you move from CLIA to FDA or from FDA into CLIA, those are, what do you want to call that?
I think it's still jurisdictions. It's not geographic, but
Yeah.
I think it's still an okay word for that.
I mean, it's
Not
Regulatory framework.
statutory? It's
across
jurisdiction.
regulatory frameworks or something, but that's also a vague term. But what I mean is, if you, let's say, in the EU, you have to comply with IVDR and with AI Act. Those are 2 different regulatory territories.
Frameworks.
Yeah. The maybe jurisdictional
Frameworks? Isn't it frameworks?
frameworks or contexts or something like that, because I make a note that we also discuss that, because for the next point, the consensus recommendation 5, actually, I like this doc, regulatory bodies, because ultimately we write this for auditors, etc. So for regulatory,
Should we, sorry.
yeah, maybe make a note. So across jurisdictional territories or regulatory bodies would be good.
Yeah,
Because
but this might work for the CLIA FDA context, but not for the EU AI Act and IVDR, right? Because this
I
is
I find it interesting because when you build a product in the EU, but you also submit it to the FDA, you are crossing jurisdictional territories and regulatory bodies. So if you act globally, the word that we just deleted, you actually have to do both. Comply with local difficulties, but also with transnational elements. But
no, I
Okay.
agree, but that's 2 parts, right? So the first one is you are staying in the same territory, locally, right? So let's say we are talking about the US and we are moving from CLIA to FDA. There's 2 different bodies involved here. So, and then that's why I think framework is better because it's more generic than a body is actually a very defined term here, and it might not cover both aspects of territorial and legal aspects.
got it. All right. That's
Claire,
Joe, this feels to me like it might just need to have a clarifying footnote because there are so many different dimensions of what it could mean depending on who you are, where you are, and what you're doing. Because if you're in Europe and you're doing something in Europe and in the US or elsewhere, and you have local, national, EU, US, and then you might have, I don't know, New York State to deal with.
Yeah.
It really feels like it's for a recommendation, we would it would behoove us to have something that is as concise as possible, but perhaps then state that or elucidate on the complexity of the short statement somewhere else in the document.
Absolutely. I think this is the reason why this is so critically important, and I like the idea of a footnote, is this can have huge business impact, right? If you have to tailor your regulatory write-up for every single jurisdiction again, and you reach, let's say, different, whatever, if one country, for example, requires ISO standards and you find yourself in a bind between definitions there, that's a huge issue. I really like the idea of defining this, that this might be national, territorial, regional, national, or supranational, or however, international. I
I
like it.
love supernatural. That's great.
We leave extraterrestrial out for now. Just for now.
That actually may be closer than supernatural.
All right. I think I want to be mindful of time. So I think we have another meeting, believe next week, Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So please take a look at the consensus recommendation 5. And yeah, please add additional notes. You've seen some folks were thankfully very active in the document. So please add your comments or revisions, because next week was so far planned the last meeting interactive, and then we moved to editing stage of the manuscript. Because I think, this is already very complicated, and I think we should submit it to a peer review process, because we will get definitely different input then. All right. Great meeting, super productive, and thanks for keeping us on track, Amanda, and making all the changes. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you. Bye, everyone.